Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. For the next little while, we'll drift together into a strange corner of the past. A past where health was not only a concern, but an obsession. Where remedies promised miracles, and where science and superstition walked side by side. Before we step into tonight's story, take a second to like this video and subscribe, so these mysteries can reach others in your family too. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see where you're tuning in from, almost like tiny lights glowing on a map across the world. The 19th century was a time of astonishing progress and bewildering superstition, a world where the clatter of iron wheels and the hiss of steam trains echoed against streets, still lit by flickering gas lamps. To walk through a Victorian city was to pass from the shadow of towering chimneys to the heavy silence of parlours filled with lace curtains and polished wood. Yet beneath this surface of industry and refinement, the people of that age lived with an unshakable obsession, the endless pursuit of health. For the Victorians, health was not merely the absence of illness, it was a moral duty, a reflection of discipline, and a marker of respectability. Pale skin could be read as refinement or weakness. A strong posture hinted at character as much as it did vitality, and behind every polished door or market stall, there seemed to be some new device, potion, or peculiar instruction promising to preserve life against the many invisible threats of the modern world. It is difficult from the comfort of today to understand the constant unease that gripped them. Disease was everywhere. Cholera moved through crowded districts with terrifying speed, leaving whole households silent by morning. Tuberculosis carried away young men and women in their prime, their decline romanticized in poetry even as families despaired. Smallpox still lurked, scarred, and claimed lives, despite the slow spread of vaccination. Even something as ordinary as a fever might carry one away. And so, health became not just a private matter, but a national fixation. The newspapers carried advertisements for pills that claimed to renew blood, syrups that cured coughs, and powders that promised beauty as much as strength. Wealthy households displayed exercise contraptions in their drawing rooms, while poor labourers clung to whatever charms or herbal remedies they could afford. Doctors themselves, some trained in anatomy, others in little more than showmanship, competed with travelling salesmen who shouted their miracles in marketplaces. To be Victorian was to live in a storm of advice, some sensible, much of it fantastical, and nearly all of it coloured by fear of sickness and longing for control. Even the very air was suspect. The Industrial Revolution had filled skies with soot, turning once clear horizons into smudges of grey. Men and women believed that foul vapours rising from damp soil or dirty streets poisoned the body. Theories of miasma, bad air that carried disease, haunted imaginations. Streets were swept, drains were dug, and windows were flung open in the belief that a fresh breeze could sweep away illness. At the same time, others warned that night air was dangerous, that an open window while sleeping might weaken the lungs or invite deadly chills. Families debated endlessly about whether a draught was healing or harmful, a matter of life and death decided by whether curtains fluttered at night. The pursuit of health extended far beyond science. It became a performance of morality. A household that practiced daily routines of washing, airing, and taking tonics was considered upright and proper, while one that neglected such practices invited whispers of sloth and sin. Women were urged to maintain delicate balance, pale enough to seem refined, but not so fragile as to appear sickly, robust enough to manage a household, but not so strong as to lose feminine grace. Men, meanwhile, were told to cultivate vigour through cold baths, early rising, and rigid posture. For a man's health was seen as a mirror of his discipline. Everyday life became a laboratory of peculiar experiments. There were rules about what should be eaten and in what order. A glass of vinegar might be taken before a meal to cleanse the blood. Gruel, thin and tasteless, was praised as a strengthening food for invalids, though it did little but leave bellies hollow. Spices were sometimes avoided for fear of overstimulating the nerves, while boiled beef and plain puddings were lauded as wholesome simplicity. Water itself was treated with suspicion. In some neighborhoods, it carried disease more surely than it carried relief. For that reason, many turned instead to beer, wine, or tonics laced with alcohol, which soothed anxieties while quietly dulling the senses. Yet amid this seriousness, there was also a constant parade of the curious. Stalls sold powders promising to brighten eyes, lozenges that claimed to expand the chest, and tinctures that promised to ward off melancholy. Electric belts buzzed faintly against the skin, supposed to invigorate weary muscles. Magnetic brushes were stroked through hair to encourage its growth. Bottles with golden labels promised to restore youth, though most contained little more than colored water or strong spirits. And in the midst of all this, the line between medicine and theatre was thin. A doctor might arrive in a fine carriage, dressed in black, bearing instruments that gleamed in candlelight. Yet his advice could be no more reliable than that of a salesman shouting atop a wooden crate. To the sleepless ear, drifting through these stories, one hears the hum of a world both terrified and enchanted by its own body. Imagine the sound of footsteps on cobblestone as a woman hurries to purchase a tonic for her coughing child, the rustle of papers as a gentleman unfolds the advertisement for a new cure, the distant toll of bells marking another funeral. Health was not a certainty, it was a fragile hope, carried in bottles and whispered in remedies, a thread pulled tightly through every corner of daily life. This obsession seeped into architecture itself. Houses were designed with long windows to admit light, for sunlight was believed to kill hidden germs. Parks were laid out with winding paths and open lawns, not simply for beauty, but for the exercise of strolling. Seaside resorts flourished, drawing crowds who believed that salt air could strengthen the lungs and cure the nerves. Entire families boarded trains to breathe deeply on windy piers, convinced that each gust was a dose of medicine. What made it all the more bewildering was that for every voice of reason, there were 10 more offering contradiction. Some physicians swore by bleeding. A few ounces of blood drained to balance the humours. Others condemned the practice as barbaric, urging instead the use of leeches, or mustard plasters, or cupping glasses that left round marks on pale backs. One doctor might urge a patient to rest quietly in darkened rooms. Another might demand brisk walks in the open air. Advice shifted with fashion, and fashion itself disguised as science. To live in this time was to walk through a fog of uncertainty, where each step toward health might just as easily lead to harm. Even the language of the age reveals its anxieties. Words like nervous exhaustion and consumption carried both diagnosis and poetry. Illness was woven into novels, painted onto canvases, whispered in drawing rooms. To be sickly was sometimes romanticized, a sign of sensitivity or spiritual depth. Yet to die of such illness was always sudden, always close. That tension between glamour and terror, between cure and danger, defined the Victorian experience of health. And still, through it all, the remedies multiplied. The chemist's shop, with its gleaming bottles and sharp scents, became a place of pilgrimage. Housewives bought powders to calm their nerves, elixirs to steady digestion, syrups to quiet sleeplessness. Children were given drops of laudanum, a soothing mixture of opium, to silence their cries. Old men swallowed tonics thick with iron to stiffen their backs. Every ailment, from the gravest disease to the smallest complaint, found its answer in some potion, machine, or ritual. The very act of buying and swallowing became an assurance. Something is being done. To listen to this world, to walk through it in the quiet hours of night, is to sense both the comfort and the strangeness of it all. The streets smell faintly of coal smoke, the parlours of camphor and lavender. A mother folds her hands in prayer before sending her child to school with a small vial of syrup. A gentleman tightens his cravat before stepping out into the morning air, silently repeating his doctor's advice. The pursuit of health was endless, winding its way through habits, beliefs, and fears until it became inseparable from daily existence. This was the world of the Victorians. a place where life seemed both fragile and improvable, where the promise of health shimmered always just out of reach. They clung to it in every ritual, every bottle, every strange device. And in that clinging, they left behind a record of remedies at once absurd, fascinating, and deeply human. Remedies that would come to define an era obsessed with living just a little longer, just a little better, no matter how peculiar the means. The Victorians lived in a world crowded with smoke, soot, and suspicion. Streets filled with clattering carts and the shrill whistles of trains carried more than sound. They carried the heavy breath of a changing age. Coal smoke hung in the air like a permanent fog, settling on windowsills, clinging to the folds of dresses, and blackening the stone facades of churches and banks. In the midst of this grey veil, a peculiar idea took hold, that health itself depended on air. Invisible currents moving through open fields, across city streets, or through the narrow cracks of a bedroom window. Fresh air became not merely a comfort, but a cure, a prescription repeated with an almost religious insistence. Doctors advised it, poets praised it, and families reorganized their lives around the belief that every breath carried healing or harm. To walk outdoors was to cleanse the body. To let a draught pass through a home was to banish sickness. And yet, like so many Victorian convictions, the rules of this cure were tangled in contradictions. One could hear, on a single street, competing warnings. A neighbour might insist that windows be thrown open at all times, allowing the bracing sweep of wind to carry away disease. Another would declare with equal passion that night air was poisonous, that to sleep in a draught was to invite fever or death. Curtains were drawn tight in one house and tied back in another. Families argued over shutters, the placement of beds, the virtue of leaving a crack in the casement. The result was a curious choreography of ventilation. Windows half open, doors propped with chairs, sheets tucked firmly at the edges, as if the very breath of a household required management. The belief in fresh air was not entirely unfounded. Crowded city tenements, where families huddled together in close rooms, were breeding grounds for illness. Tuberculosis, with its slow wasting grip, thrived where the air was still and damp. Cholera, though carried in water rather than air, was blamed on foul smells and stagnant breezes, and so, to seek out clean, moving air became a form of defense, a way to draw invisible lines between health and decay. Walks became medicine. Gentlemen rose early to stroll through parks, puffing their chests against the morning chill, convinced that each inhalation fortified their blood. Ladies, swathed in layers of fabric, took carriage rides through tree-lined avenues, breathing deeply when the city's smog lifted enough to reveal patches of sky. For children, fresh air was thought essential to growth. Schools, even in crowded cities, were urged to open windows wide, no matter the season, so that young lungs might fill with something purer than the dust of chalk and coal. Seaside air, in particular, was praised with near mystical devotion. Resorts along the coast swelled with visitors who believed the salt wind could strengthen frail constitutions. Entire families packed trunks and boarded trains to spend weeks by the sea, watching waves crash as they sat bundled in shawls on wooden benches. Physicians prescribed trips to the coast for patients suffering from nervous exhaustion, weak lungs, or even vague maladies of the spirit. Children with coughs were marched across sandy beaches at dawn, their small boots leaving trails in the damp sand as parents urged them to breathe deeply, to swallow the sea air like a tonic. The countryside too became a kind of outdoor pharmacy. Meadows and forests, once valued for their beauty or their resources, were now viewed as reservoirs of invisible health. A stroll through pine woods was thought to clear the lungs. A walk along rolling fields was said to soothe the mind. The poor, living in cramped dwellings with little chance of escape, looked with longing at such remedies, often available only to those with means. And so, fresh air was not merely a cure, but a privilege, a marker of class as well as of health. Homes themselves were built to reflect this obsession. Architects designed houses with long windows and high ceilings, believing that stagnant air could be dangerous. Conservatories and verandas became fashionable, not just as ornaments, but as semi-outdoor spaces where families could linger without fear. Bedrooms were often arranged with great care, beds pulled toward windows or angled to catch a breeze. Manuals of household management offered strict advice. The sickroom must be aired each morning. Curtains should not be allowed to stifle circulation. Chimneys, even unused, should remain unblocked to encourage upward drafts. Yet alongside this devotion to openness lay an equally strong fear. The night air, in particular, was regarded with dread. The same families who insisted on daytime ventilation often sealed themselves in at dusk, convinced that cool breezes carried death. Shutters were drawn tight, keyholes stuffed, even chimneys stopped, in the hope of keeping the nocturnal dangers outside. Children were warned not to linger near open windows after sunset, lest their lungs weaken or their bodies chill. This contradiction, welcoming air by day, banishing it by night, reveals the strange uncertainty of the age, caught between tradition and discovery, instinct and invention. Hospitals and asylums, too, absorbed this creed. Wards were built with wide windows and open courtyards, allowing patients to sit in sunlight and wind. Nurses wheeled invalids onto terraces, covering them with blankets, but leaving faces exposed to the breeze. Doctors wrote of the curative powers of open-air treatment, sometimes placing entire beds outside, even in winter, so that weak lungs might grow strong. Photographs survive of patients reclining on verandas, snow piled on the railings beside them, their cheeks flushed with cold, as attendants urged them to inhale deeply. At times, the faith in air took on almost comical proportions. Families transported sick relatives to mountain resorts, convinced that altitude itself contained healing. Others built sleeping porches, small outdoor chambers where beds were wheeled out nightly, no matter the weather. Even the design of clothing reflected the fixation. Looser garments, lighter fabrics, and smaller hats were sometimes promoted on the grounds that they allowed freer breathing, though fashion rarely bowed fully to health. The language of the time reveals how deeply these ideas were woven into thought. Air was not simply described as fresh or foul. It was pure, invigorating, bracing, or poisonous. Breezes were compared to tonics. Winds were likened to medicines. To breathe deeply was to drink, to nourish, to cleanse. Every lungful became an act of faith, a tiny battle against unseen enemies. Of course, not all air was trusted equally. Industrial smoke, heavy with soot and ash, provoked constant alarm. Chimneys belched above factory towns, and citizens raised endless petitions for cleaner skies. In some cities, the smog was so thick that lamps burned even at midday, and the horizon blurred into a permanent dusk. For those who could afford it, escape became routine. Wealthy families fled to country estates during the worst months, leaving behind the labourers who had no choice but to inhale the grit of their own toil. In this way, fresh air was both a medicine and a mirror, reflecting the inequalities of the age as clearly as any ledger. Yet despite the contradictions, despite the uncertainties, the fixation endured. Parks were expanded, tree planting campaigns launched, seaside resorts thrived. Open windows, country walks, bracing winds, all became part of the rhythm of Victorian life. And in that rhythm, one hears the echo of longing, a desire not only for health, but for certainty, for something solid to hold against the chaos of disease and the mysteries of medicine. It is easy now to smile at the excesses, to imagine layers of blankets piled on a sick child, sitting on a frosty balcony, or families debating endlessly over whether a cracked window would save them or doom them. But within these rituals lay something earnest, something deeply human. In a world of invisible threats and uncertain remedies, the air itself became a companion, at times comforting, at times feared, always present. Drifting through their world, one can almost hear the quiet rustle of curtains stirred by a winter wind, the creak of a window sash raised in the pale light of dawn, the distant cry of gulls over a seaside town, where families sat breathing as if each gust might carry them into strength. This was the Victorian age, where health was not only swallowed in bottles or strapped on with devices, but inhaled with every breath, drawn in and out with hope, with fear, and with the endless patience of those who sought to master life through the air itself. If air was thought to purify the lungs, then water was believed to fortify the flesh. For the Victorians, health was a discipline, and nowhere was that discipline more visibly performed than in the ritual of bathing, cold, bracing, and for many, unpleasantly shocking. The age carried with it a fascination for extremes. To rise before dawn, to deny the body comfort, to embrace hardship. These were seen as virtues. Cold water embodied this philosophy perfectly. It was nature's own tonic, free to anyone with access to a pump, a river, or a tin tub. To immerse oneself in its chill was to prove one's strength of will as much as one's vigor of body. And so, a cult of cold bathing emerged, woven from strands of science, morality, and spectacle. Mornings in many Victorian households began with the splash of icy water against bare skin. Manuals of health urged men to plunge their faces, arms, and even whole bodies into basins filled with water drawn straight from the pump. Invigorating, they called it, though the word barely concealed the sharp gasp, the shuddering breath, the blue-tinged lips of those who endured it. A warm bath was indulgence. A cold bath was discipline. To step into chilled water at dawn was to conquer weakness, to signal that the day would be met with firmness and control. For the wealthy, bathing became an elaborate ritual. Country houses boasted bathing chambers, tiled in marble, and fitted with pumps or pipes that delivered water in abundance. Some even constructed plunge pools where gentlemen could throw themselves into waist-deep cold water before breakfast, emerging with dripping hair and flushed cheeks. Guests were sometimes invited or pressured to join, their laughter masking discomfort as they shivered together in tiled, echoing rooms. In cities, where such luxuries were rare, public baths and washhouses offered the experience to the masses. Rows of wooden cubicles held shallow tubs where cold water waited, and for a small coin, one could strip away soot and sweat, submitting to the shiver that promised cleanliness and health. These places served not only the poor, who lacked bathing facilities at home, but also the devout practitioners of cold water cures, who saw in each plunge a renewal of the spirit as well as the body. Doctors and health reformers added their voices, dressing this habit in scientific authority. Pamphlets praised cold bathing as a means of hardening the body against illness. A plunge was said to stimulate circulation, awaken the nervous system, and build resistance to fevers. Delicate children, pale and thin, were often urged to endure the shock of icy water in the hope that it might toughen their frames. Mothers poured pitchers over small shoulders, while boys were marched into rivers at dawn, shivering as they tried to appear brave beneath parental eyes. The rivers themselves became theatres of health. At dawn, before the city fully stirred, one might find figures wading into the Thames, or into lakes and ponds in country estates. Some swam with determination, others merely dipped, but all shared in the belief that water carried renewal. In seaside towns, wooden bathing machines, small huts on wheels, were rolled into the surf, allowing bathers to step directly into the waves, shielded from public view. Ladies, dressed in modest bathing gowns, clutched ropes as attendants guided them into the breakers, the cold water lifting hems and gasps alike. Gentlemen, more boldly, strode straight into the sea, their bodies stiffening with the shock, their voices carrying across the waves. Even the language of health reformers was saturated with watery imagery. To cleanse, to purge, to wash away impurities, these were metaphors as well as instructions. Water was not merely for dirt, it was for the unseen poisons of modern life. Cold immersion was said to draw out fevers, to restore balance, to awaken dulled spirits. Warmth was weakness, cold was strength. And so, even those who despised the sensation often endured it. convinced that health demanded sacrifice. Hydropathy, or the water cure, rose in prominence during these years. Institutions dedicated to its practice sprang up across Britain, offering elaborate treatments that went far beyond simple bathing. Patients were wrapped in wet sheets, doused with buckets of cold water, or made to sit in baths of varying depths and temperatures. They drank mineral waters, bathed in springs, and followed strict regimens designed to realign the body's inner forces. Some of these establishments resembled country resorts, where guests strolled gardens between treatments, sipping glasses of clear water as though it were fine wine. To visit such a place was both fashionable and virtuous, a mark of refinement and seriousness about health. But as with all Victorian remedies, contradictions abounded. Advocates of cold water clashed with those who believed warmth soothed and healed. Doctors argued in journals and pamphlets, their words laced with authority, yet underpinned by little more than conviction. Families found themselves caught between competing doctrines. Should the sick child be plunged into icy water to shock away disease, or wrapped in blankets beside the fire to coax strength back gently? The answer often depended less on evidence than on which voice carried greater confidence. The cult of bathing also revealed the era's peculiar blend of science and morality. To submit oneself to cold water was not simply a health measure, it was an act of will, a proof of character. A weak person avoided discomfort, a strong one embraced it. The shiver of cold was recast as a mark of virtue, a sign that one was not ruled by softness or indulgence. Families praised children who endured their cold plunges without complaint, treating them as miniature heroes of the household. Even literature of the time occasionally drew on these images, painting the hardy bather as a figure of discipline and the invalid as one of fragility. At the same time, bathing was linked to cleanliness, and cleanliness to morality. To be dirty was not only unhealthy, but suspect, a sign of slovenliness or even sin. Cold water, therefore, carried a double weight. It purified the body from disease and the soul from vice. A family who bathed regularly was upright, one who did not risk whispers of neglect or worse. The splash of water in the morning basin became a sound of virtue, echoing across tiled floors and wooden staircases. And yet, beneath the earnestness, one cannot ignore the absurdities. Imagine rows of shivering men wrapped in damp sheets at a hydropathic institute, waiting as attendants poured yet another pail of cold water over them. Picture the startled cries of ladies stepping into surf from their bathing machines, attendants steadying them as waves slapped against modest gowns. Think of children stiff with cold as their mothers briskly rubbed them down with coarse towels, assuring them that the shivers meant health was building within. These images, both comic and poignant, remind us of the lengths to which Victorians would go in their quest for wellness. The obsession was not without risk. Drowning incidents were reported as swimmers misjudged rivers or seas. Frail patients, subjected to extreme cold water regimens, sometimes worsened rather than improved. But the stories of failure rarely silenced the faith. Successes, real or imagined, were celebrated loudly, while misfortunes faded into quieter corners. Like so many health fads, the cult of cold baths endured because it offered hope, and hope was more compelling than doubt. As one drifts through the memory of this world, the sensory details linger. The sting of icy water against skin, the sharp intake of breath as a body plunges into a river, the creak of wooden wheels carrying a bathing machine across sand, the drip of water echoing in tiled chambers where gentlemen shook themselves dry before breakfast. All these sounds and sensations form part of the Victorian landscape, as much as chimneys or carriages, or the rustle of skirts along a promenade. Water, in all its forms, was embraced as nature's most accessible remedy, a companion in the endless battle for health. Whether in rivers, tubs, seas, or spas, it was taken not only as cleanliness, but as cure, as discipline, as ritual. And in the cold shock of its embrace, the Victorians sought a strange kind of comfort, the belief that by surrendering to discomfort, they might secure strength, purity, and a little more time in a world forever shadowed by illness. Discipline did not stop at air and water. It seeped into fabric, into bone, into the very way bodies were shaped and displayed. For the Victorians, health was not only measured in clear lungs or clean skin, but in the posture of a back, the curve of a waist, the way one carried oneself through the world. To stand upright was to embody strength and virtue. To stoop or sag was to betray weakness, both physical and moral. And so, clothing itself became a kind of medicine, a tool of correction and control, with the corset at its heart. In parlours and bedrooms, across towns and cities, corsets were laced tight with a deliberate hand. The stiff whalebone stays, drawn close around the torso, forced the body into an hourglass shape, narrow at the waist, swelling at the hips and bust. This was beauty, yes, but it was also believed to be health. A straight spine, a lifted chest, a firm stomach. These were the signs of vigor, of refinement, of respectability. A drooping figure suggested languor, perhaps even moral decay. Good posture meant good character, and so mothers urged daughters to lace themselves firmly, while doctors published earnest warnings about the dangers of slouching. Corsets were not merely fashion, they were a philosophy stitched into cloth. Advertisements spoke of their ability to support weak backs, to improve digestion by holding the stomach in place, even to strengthen breathing by forcing the chest upward. The medical corset, a curious hybrid between garment and brace, was prescribed for spinal weakness or curvature. Some were fitted with straps and steel supports, transforming clothing into something closer to armor. To wear one was to declare not just beauty, but health. To show the world a figure trained into order. But the pressure was more than physical. A woman's waist became a symbol, measured, admired, and whispered about. The smaller it appeared, the greater the proof of discipline, self-control, and attractiveness. Society praised those who endured the tightest laces, as though the ability to withstand discomfort were itself a virtue. For young women especially, the struggle for the perfect body was not optional, it was expected. Ballrooms glittered with silhouettes shaped by whalebone, parlours filled with rustling skirts that concealed rigidly confined forms. To breathe shallowly, to sit stiffly, to faint when the room grew warm, these were woven into the performance of femininity. And men, though spared the whalebone embrace, were not free from the tyranny of posture. Manuals of conduct and health pressed upon them the importance of standing tall, shoulders back, chest out, as though each man were a soldier on parade. Weakness of spine or drooping of head was considered a sign of poor discipline, even unmanliness. Posture-correcting chairs appeared in offices and studies, designed to force the sitter into an upright pose. Some contraptions strapped across shoulders, pulling them backward until the wearer resembled a marionette held taut by invisible strings. To slump was to fail not only in health, but in character. Schools, too, carried this obsession. Children were drilled not only in lessons, but in how they sat at their desks. Straight backs, folded hands, heads lifted. These were lessons as important as reading and arithmetic. Teachers patrolled rows, rapping knuckles or adjusting postures, convinced that crooked spines led to crooked morals. Photographs of schoolrooms show neat lines of stiff-backed pupils, each child a small figure of enforced uprightness, their very bodies shaped by rules. The pursuit of posture bled into daily life in quiet, relentless ways. Dining tables were arenas of correction, parents reminding children to sit tall, not to lean, not to sprawl. Walking was to be done with dignity, steps measured, arms relaxed, but not swinging wildly. Even at rest, bodies were not allowed to collapse. Reclining was for the sickroom. The healthy sat poised, alert, contained. In the middle-class parlour, where every detail signalled respectability, a drooping guest might earn silent disapproval, their lax posture interpreted as moral slackness. The corset, of course, was both praised and reviled. While many physicians endorsed it, others began to sound alarms. They warned of compressed lungs, displaced organs, fainting spells, even premature death. Medical journals carried debates over the dangers of tight lacing, complete with illustrations of rib cages distorted by years of pressure. Some reformers denounced the practice outright, calling it barbaric, unnatural, and cruel. Yet despite these warnings, the fashion endured, its hold stronger than any protest. Beauty, discipline, and social expectation outweighed whispers of harm. Women laced themselves tighter still, chasing waists small enough to be encircled by a man's hands, while manufacturers devised stronger fabrics and clever fastenings to meet the demand. Alongside the corset came an array of devices and guides promising to correct posture and shape. Shoulder braces, elastic belts, and steel supports were sold in shops, advertised in newspapers, and prescribed by doctors. Books of etiquette instructed readers in the correct way to sit, stand, and even lie down. Illustrations showed ideal figures, their backs like plumb lines, their waists impossibly narrow. These images were not merely ideals of beauty, but of health, proof that the body could be disciplined into harmony. Yet for all the seriousness, there was something theatrical about it too. The drawing room, with its mirrors and lamplight, became a stage where corseted figures glided and bowed, their movements constrained yet graceful. To faint gracefully in a warm room was almost a performance, a demonstration of delicacy admired as much as pitied. Gentlemen adjusted their posture as they entered, puffing out their chests as though armor lay beneath their coats. The body itself became costume, shaped and corrected to meet the age's expectations. And beneath it all lingered the quiet suffering of those who endured. Women spoke of shallow breaths, of aching ribs, of faintness that turned daily life into a battle against one's own clothing. Men struggled against straps that cut into shoulders, contraptions that bit into flesh. Children were chided until their backs ached from effort. But discomfort was normalized, even celebrated, because it signified discipline. To suffer in the name of posture was to prove oneself worthy, healthy, respectable. The irony, of course, was that the quest for health often undermined it. Corsets that restricted breathing weakened lungs rather than strengthened them. Posture devices that pulled shoulders rigidly back caused pain rather than relief. Fainting, though romanticized, was dangerous. But the Victorians lived in a world where appearances carried as much weight as facts, where moral judgment colored every choice. If a woman looked graceful, if a man looked upright, then surely they were healthier, better, more refined. The illusion became the reality. In the quiet of that world, one can almost hear the rustle of skirts against polished floors, the faint creak of whalebone stays under tension, the clipped voice of a parent reminding a child to sit tall. The very atmosphere of the age seemed stiffened, held upright by invisible laces. The battle for the perfect body was not waged only in drawing rooms or ballrooms. It was fought daily, hour by hour, in every gesture, every breath restrained by fabric, every spine forced into rigidity. Discipline of air, of water, of posture, all were threads in the same fabric of Victorian health. To live well was to live tightly bound, upright, and enduring, convinced that each restriction and correction brought one closer to vitality. Health was not freedom, it was control, the careful shaping of body and behavior until both seemed almost mechanical, a performance played for society's constant gaze. And in that performance, the Victorians revealed both their fear and their longing. Fear of weakness, sickness, and decay. Longing for strength, beauty, and approval. The corset, the straight back, the perfect pose. These were not merely fashions or habits. They were the embodiment of an age obsessed with order, with appearances, with the fragile hope that health could be stitched, laced, and strapped into place. The body, laced and upright, might have looked orderly, but beneath its fabric discipline lay a constant fear, illness. Sickness haunted the Victorian imagination like a shadow at the edge of every lamplit street. It was there in the smog that filled the lungs, in the fever that swept through crowded houses, in the pallor that hinted at decline. And in a world so uncertain, the figure of the doctor held a peculiar kind of power. He arrived at the bedside with his black bag, his grave expression, his air of authority. Patients and families looked to him for comfort, for certainty, for cures. Yet the cures he carried were not always what one might expect, and many of them were more dangerous than the disease itself. In the quiet clink of bottles and the scratch of prescriptions, the Victorian doctor dealt not only in herbs and tonics, but in poisons, substances so deadly that a few grains could end a life. Arsenic, mercury, strychnine, antimony, names that today evoke caution and warning labels were then regarded as medicines of real promise. They were prescribed with care, but also with confidence, as though the doctor's hand could transform danger into remedy. Arsenic, in particular, occupied a strange place in Victorian health. It was known as a deadly poison, infamous for its use in murders both real and imagined, its tastelessness and solubility making it the favoured weapon of novels and sensational trials. Yet it was also sold over the counter, ground into powders, mixed into tonics, even incorporated into beauty products. Doctors prescribed it for a wide range of ailments, skin diseases, rheumatism, digestive troubles, even as a general tonic to strengthen the constitution. In small doses, they insisted, arsenic could stimulate the body, improve appetite, brighten the eyes, and clear the complexion. So common was its use that an entire culture of arsenic taking developed in parts of Europe, most famously in certain Austrian and Styrian mountain villages. Travellers returned with tales of peasants who swallowed lumps of arsenic before climbing into the high pastures, believing it gave them energy and endurance. They claimed their lungs filled more easily with mountain air, their limbs felt lighter, their skin looked healthier. The reports fascinated Victorian readers, and doctors took note. If peasants could thrive on arsenic, perhaps patients too could benefit. Pharmacies carried arsenic wafers, tiny doses pressed into delicate discs that promised beauty and vitality. Ladies, seeking pale and luminous skin, were said to take them regularly, believing the poison refined their features and banished blemishes. Advertisements couched in respectable language offered arsenical preparations as though they were no more dangerous than soap or tea. Behind the polished counters of apothecaries, the line between cure and poison blurred into something both alluring and unsettling. Mercury held a similar troubling prestige. Long before the Victorians, it had been used to treat syphilis, a disease that carried not only physical suffering, but immense social stigma. By the 19th century, mercury treatments were common, ranging from ointments rubbed into the skin to pills swallowed daily. A night with Venus, a lifetime with Mercury, the saying went, acknowledging the grim irony that the supposed cure often brought its own torments. Salivation, tooth loss, trembling, and madness. Yet still it was prescribed, for doctors had little else to offer, and the logic of the time insisted that powerful diseases required powerful remedies. Strychnine, drawn from the seeds of the Nux vomica tree, was another poison turned medicine. Deadly in excess, it was believed in small doses to act as a stimulant for the nervous system, a way to sharpen the senses, strengthen weak muscles, and invigorate the heart. Athletes and sportsmen experimented with it, sometimes under medical guidance, sometimes not. Doctors, too, used it for patients suffering from paralysis, digestive sluggishness, or general malaise. To prescribe strychnine was to walk a razor's edge between therapy and danger, yet it was done with solemn assurance, as though precision could tame lethality. Antimony joined this arsenal of toxic cures. Long valued as an emetic, it was given to provoke vomiting, purging the body of what was believed to be harmful substances. Victorian medicine clung to the idea that illness came from imbalance, from humours or impurities lodged within. To purge, to sweat, to bleed. These were seen as acts of cleansing, returning the body to harmony. Antimony, like arsenic, straddled the line between cure and peril, its doses carefully calculated but never without risk. In drawing rooms and sick rooms alike, patients submitted to these treatments, trusting in their doctor's wisdom. The rituals of medicine carried their own authority, the solemn mixing of powders, the careful pouring of drops, the quiet instructions to swallow. pain, discomfort, or strange sensations were interpreted as proof that the medicine was working, that the body was being stirred into action. To feel nothing might suggest uselessness. To feel worse was paradoxically reassuring. In this way, suffering itself became a kind of evidence. Not all who dealt in these remedies were doctors. The Victorian marketplace teemed with patent medicines and tonics, bottles lined in shop windows, advertised in newspapers with extravagant claims. Many contained arsenic, mercury, or other poisons, though their labels gave little hint of danger. Elixirs for nervous weakness, female complaints, or general debility promised restoration, energy, and renewed vitality. They were sold without prescription, available to anyone with the coin to purchase them, and they filled homes with glass bottles whose contents shimmered like salvation. The public fascination with such cures mingled uneasily with fear. Poisonings, both accidental and deliberate, appeared regularly in newspapers, each case fueling both horror and morbid fascination. A husband accused of slipping arsenic into his wife's tea, a servant suspected of tampering with sugar, a child dead after swallowing a bottle left carelessly open. These stories gripped readers, blending domestic familiarity with lethal drama. Yet the same substances that killed also healed. Their presence in both crime reports and medical journals a reminder of how thin the line between remedy and murder could be. For all the dangers, the Victorians did not see themselves as reckless. To their minds, these substances were part of the same natural order as herbs and minerals, each with powers that could be harnessed if guided by knowledge. The doctor's role was to balance, to calculate, to ensure that the dose was just enough to provoke benefit without tipping into harm. Medicine was not yet the science it would become. It was as much art as discipline, a matter of judgment shaped by tradition, observation, and authority. And so, arsenic was both feared and revered, mercury both dreaded and relied upon, strychnine both condemned and celebrated. Patients accepted their prescriptions with trust, even gratitude, because the alternative was worse: to face illness with nothing at all. Better to risk a poison that promised cure than to surrender to decline. The black bottles, the powders and tinctures, the acrid taste on the tongue, all these were tokens of hope, however strange that hope now seems. As the century moved forward, doubts grew louder. Critics began to question whether these poisons cured or merely masked symptoms. Cases of poisoning from medical treatments carefully recorded began to trouble the profession. Reformers called for clearer labeling, for stricter controls on sales, for a more cautious approach. Yet the habits of decades do not vanish quickly, and poisons continued to flow from pharmacy shelves well into the later Victorian years, their dual nature never fully resolved. Looking back, it is easy to recoil, to wonder how such dangerous practices could ever have been considered normal. Yet in their world, where illness was constant and remedies few, the willingness to experiment with poisons was less folly than desperation. The Victorians lived on a tightrope of health and sickness, their lives shadowed by epidemics, chronic ailments, and sudden declines. The doctor's poisons, however fearsome, offered at least the illusion of control, a way to act rather than simply endure. And so, in that dim-lit room where the patient lies beneath a heavy quilt, the doctor's hand pours a measured dose. The family waits in anxious silence, and the air carries the bitter scent of medicine. The poison touches the tongue, burns in the throat, settles in the stomach. Is it cure or curse? In the Victorian imagination, it was both at once, remedy and danger, salvation and peril, bound together in every swallow. The Victorian world seemed to vibrate with invisible forces. Gas lamps hissed in the streets, telegraph wires stretched across fields, and in parlours one could sit with a brass contraption and send words flashing across miles of countryside in the blink of an eye. The very air seemed charged with a new kind of energy, and for many, electricity was not simply a tool of progress. It was a mystery, a wonder, a cure. Where earlier generations had trusted in herbs, bleeding, or the alchemy of poisons, the Victorians increasingly turned their gaze to this unseen current that could jolt a frog's leg into motion, light a filament until it glowed, or travel silently down a wire to animate machines. If it could move metal and muscle alike, might it not also restore health, invigorate the weak, or pull sickness from the body? The idea was too tempting to ignore, and soon a wave of electrical devices began humming their way into homes, clinics, and the imaginations of patients. The principle was simple, at least in promise: apply a current to the body, and vitality would follow. Illness, many believed, was a form of sluggishness, a kind of stasis in which the body had forgotten its natural rhythms. Electricity, then, was not merely energy but life itself, a spark that could awaken dormant organs, stir lazy nerves, and force the body into renewed activity. Advertisements claimed as much, with engravings of elegant ladies seated serenely as wires looped around their wrists, or stoic gentlemen placing their feet upon copper plates while polished dials ticked and spun. One of the most popular instruments was the so-called electrotherapy belt, a wide strap lined with wires and small batteries, designed to be buckled discreetly beneath clothing. Worn close to the skin, it promised to deliver a constant current, invisible yet restorative. Makers claimed it could cure everything from nervous exhaustion to digestive troubles, from impotence to melancholia. The idea that one might walk through the day secretly charged with vitality appealed to many, and the belts sold in astonishing numbers, filling catalogues with polished brass fittings and grandiose claims. Then there were the more elaborate contraptions, machines that occupied whole tabletops, their cranks and coils gleaming like miniature engines. Some required the patient to grip metal handles as a current surged through their arms. Others involved wet sponges pressed to the skin, the shock sharp enough to cause a shudder but praised as invigorating. Doctors, too, began to employ them in clinics, their authority lending weight to the notion that electricity could do what traditional medicines could not. For those who suffered from paralysis or weakness, the machines offered a strange kind of proof. A limb that would not move under its own will might twitch when the current was applied, fingers jerking open and closed, a leg kicking as though animated by unseen strings. To see this involuntary movement was to glimpse possibility, to feel that the body was not entirely lost, that life still lingered beneath the surface. Even if cure remained elusive, the spark of hope was enough to justify the ritual of treatment. Not all applications were so sober. In the bustling world of traveling shows and street demonstrations, electricity became spectacle as much as therapy. Demonstrators invited audiences to experience a mild shock, the jolt eliciting laughter, shrieks, or claims of sudden clarity. Portable machines whirred and clicked, their handles passed from hand to hand, while the promise of healing mingled with entertainment. To be electrified was to feel modern, to step into a future where energy itself might banish illness. The allure of electricity also mingled with the mysteries of the nervous system. The Victorians understood little of how nerves carried signals, but they suspected strongly that electricity was the key. Was not the shock of lightning akin to the spark that leapt between muscle and mind? If electricity could animate a corpse in a laboratory, as curious experiments suggested, might it not also restore vigor to the living? Doctors wrote treatises on the matter, their diagrams filled with wires and currents, their faith in the invisible current outpacing their actual knowledge. In homes, smaller devices flourished: magnetic brushes, galvanic rings, electrified combs that promised to stimulate the scalp and encourage hair growth. To brush one's hair while bathing it in unseen forces was to feel both practical and scientific, grooming and medicine combined. Toothaches, headaches, nervousness, all could be soothed, or so the makers declared, by the steady pulse of magnetism. Newspapers brimmed with testimonials, readers praising their restored energy, their improved sleep, their banished fatigue. Electricity was also linked, in curious ways, to morality and vigor. Just as corsets disciplined the body and arsenic brightened the skin, the current was imagined as a tonic for the will. A man who felt drained whether by labor or by nocturnal excess, might seek an electrical cure to restore his strength. Women, too, were encouraged to submit to treatments for nerves, for hysteria, for the vague but persistent ailments that Victorian medicine so often attributed to the female constitution. The whir of the machine, the sharp spark on the skin, the strange hum in the air, all these became part of the language of health. There were critics, of course. Some dismissed the devices as little more than toys, their currents too weak to do more than startle. Others warned that unscrupulous sellers exploited desperation, charging high prices for belts and machines that offered no more benefit than a brisk walk. But the fascination endured, for electricity carried a symbolism that went beyond mere medicine. It was modernity itself, humming and sparking, a force that promised to reorder not only the body but the world. And it was not confined to the sick. Healthy individuals, too, experimented with machines, convinced that a little extra current might sharpen the mind or invigorate the senses. To sit in the evening with a galvanic device was to feel part of an age of discovery, to believe one was tapping into the same force that powered engines and illuminated cities. Even when results were uncertain, the ritual itself was comforting, a reminder that health might be reclaimed by harnessing the very energy that now coursed through wires across the nation. The hum of these machines echoed the broader Victorian belief that health could be engineered, that with the right devices, tonics, or disciplines, the body could be shaped, improved, and preserved. Electricity, in its mysterious power, embodied this dream more vividly than most. It was invisible yet undeniable, modern yet elemental, dangerous yet alluring. To channel it into the human body was to flirt with both wonder and risk, a balance the Victorians seemed endlessly willing to attempt. In parlours, in clinics, in travelling shows, the current flowed, sometimes gentle, sometimes sharp, always accompanied by the hope that within its invisible force lay the secret to health. And as the wires stretched farther, binding cities and villages into new webs of connection, the belief grew that what healed the body might also heal the world, stitching together the fabric of life with sparks that leapt unseen. The patient seated with hands upon the brass handles, the family gathered in curious silence, the machine ticking softly as the current hums. This was the Victorian promise of electricity, a strange science, a therapy, a spectacle. Whether cure or illusion, it was embraced with the same fervour that once welcomed poisons in bottles and powders. For in the restless search for health, no current was too strange, no machine too improbable, if it carried the promise of life renewed. The spark of machines may have promised vitality, but many Victorians preferred their cures not in jolts and shocks, but in bottles. On every high street and in every town market, shelves glittered with glass filled with liquids of every hue, amber, ruby, emerald green, each one a promise sealed beneath a cork. These were not merely medicines, they were bottled hopes, the kind of cure one could sip discreetly, mix with water, or take by the spoonful before bed. If electricity was the language of the modern age, then tonics and snake oils spoke with an older, more familiar voice, that of comfort, ritual, and taste. The age was flooded with such concoctions. Some came in ornate bottles etched with fine lettering, others in humble jars with peeling labels. They promised relief from nerves, headaches, stomach ailments, lassitude, even despair itself. Many were marketed as cure-alls, panaceas that could soothe both body and spirit, leaving the weary Victorian reassured that whatever their complaint, one medicine could suffice. The idea of a single elixir capable of addressing every ailment appealed to a world where sickness felt omnipresent and remedies scarce. At the heart of many of these bottles lay alcohol. It was an ingredient as common as water in patent medicines, its warmth mistaken for healing. A dose of tonic brought not only the comfort of ritual, but the glow of intoxication, a soft blurring of pain, a brief sense of energy. The bitter herbs or pungent flavors masked the spirit within, But the effect was unmistakable. A nervous housewife, sipping her soothing cordial for sleeplessness, was in truth taking a stiff measure of brandy laced with opium. A weary clerk, drinking a spoonful of invigorating tonic before work, was swallowing not just bark extract but enough alcohol to dull fatigue. Opium itself ran like a quiet current through many bottled remedies. Laudanum, a mixture of opium and alcohol, was sold freely in chemists' shops, its label adorned with nothing more alarming than decorative script. It was used for headaches, coughs, digestive troubles, menstrual pains, and, most tragically, for soothing children. Mothers dosed their infants with soothing syrups containing opium, quieting their cries with a drug they did not understand. For adults, the relief was undeniable. Pain ebbed, sleep came easily, but the cost was dependency, the slow tightening of a grip that many did not escape. Yet opium was far from the only exotic ingredient to find its way into glass. Coca, derived from the leaves of the South American coca plant, arrived in Europe with tales of energy, stamina, and euphoria. Infused into wines, syrups, and elixirs, it promised to banish exhaustion and fill the body with vigor. One particularly famous preparation, Vin Mariani, combined Bordeaux wine with coca and was praised by popes, artists, and statesmen alike. A sip brought not only the warmth of wine, but the unmistakable lift of cocaine. A miracle that seemed to dissolve the burdens of fatigue with intoxicating speed. Snake oil itself, whether drawn from serpents or merely named for them, carried its own mythology. Imported tales from America spoke of oils rendered from snakes used by native healers, reputed to soothe joint pain and inflammation. By the time such products reached Victorian shelves, the oils were often blended with camphor, turpentine, or little more than mineral oil, but the name alone carried power. To rub a joint with snake oil liniment was to believe one was tapping into ancient, almost mystical wisdom, even as the ingredients varied wildly from one bottle to another. The spectacle of these bottled miracles was not confined to chemists' shops. Traveling salesmen, hawkers, showmen, quack doctors brought them to marketplaces, fairs, and even village greens. They stood upon wagons draped with banners, holding aloft bottles that gleamed in the sun, their voices carrying through the crowd. They spoke of miraculous recoveries, of patients once bent double with pain, now leaping with joy, of consumptives restored, of women made youthful again. Behind them, hired actors might stagger onto the stage, coughing and pale, only to sip a dose and suddenly spring back to vigor, their cheeks flushed with improbable health. The audience, caught between skepticism and wonder, often parted with their coins, tucking bottles into baskets and pockets as they went home. The ritual of trying the tonic became part of domestic life. A spoonful after dinner, a sip before bed, a secret indulgence in moments of fatigue. Even if the cure was only fleeting, it was real enough in sensation to sustain belief. Not all bottled remedies were charlatan tricks. Some contained genuine plant extracts that offered relief: quinine for fevers, willow bark for pain, peppermint for digestion. But these were usually mixed with alcohol, sugar, and other ingredients that blurred the line between medicine and indulgence. The patient's relief, whether from chemistry or intoxication, mattered less than the reassurance of doing something, of taking action against the constant threat of illness. Victorian advertising fed this culture with relentless vigor. Newspapers brimmed with full-page spreads, their engravings depicting radiant men and women lifting bottles, their eyes bright, their hair lustrous. Testimonials filled the margins. After suffering for 10 years, I am restored. This elixir saved my life. My nerves are steady, my complexion clear, thanks to this marvelous tonic. The language was lyrical, almost spiritual, presenting medicine not as science, but as salvation. The reach of these products extended far beyond Britain. Bottled remedies were shipped across oceans, their labels promising miracles in colonies and foreign cities alike. They became global commodities, their names known from London to Calcutta, from Manchester to Cape Town. The Victorian age, with its networks of trade and empire, ensured that a bottle labelled in English might be swallowed in a distant land, its taste mingling with unfamiliar climates and customs. Yet for all the glittering promises, dangers lurked within the glass. Addiction crept quietly into homes, disguised as nightly doses of cordial. Children wasted away under the influence of opium-laced syrups. Livers failed beneath the steady intake of alcohol disguised as medicine. Newspapers occasionally carried reports of overdoses, scandals, or deaths, but these were drowned out by the tide of advertising and the hunger for cures. The tonic bottle, lined up neatly on the mantel or tucked discreetly into a cupboard, remained a trusted companion in a world where doctors were costly and sickness constant. The culture of bottled miracles also shaped social rituals. A guest might be offered not only tea or sherry, but a spoonful of cordial, a mark of both hospitality and modernity. Women kept bottles in dressing tables. Men carried small vials in coat pockets. To partake was not only to seek health, but to participate in the age's fascination with science, commerce, and self-improvement. Each sip connected the individual to a broader world of industry and invention, even if the contents were more intoxicating than curative. As decades passed, pressure mounted for reform. Campaigners demanded clearer labeling, calling for manufacturers to reveal the true contents of their remedies. Doctors began to push back against the most extravagant claims, warning of dangers, insisting on regulation. Slowly, the tide turned, though never fully. Bottled tonics did not vanish. They simply evolved, repackaged in new forms. Their promises softened, but never silenced. The faith in elixirs, it seemed, was too deeply rooted to be undone entirely. Looking back, one can almost see the Victorian home by lamplight. The bottle set carefully on the table, the spoon glinting in the glow, the patient leaning back in their chair as the liquid warms the throat and softens the mind. The weariness of the day ebbs away. The body feels lighter, the world less heavy. For a moment, at least, the promise is fulfilled, not because the illness is cured, but because hope itself has been swallowed. And so, in rows of bottles lined across pharmacy shelves, in wagons rattling through village squares, in advertisements filling newspapers, the Victorians found their miracles in liquid form. Strange, dangerous, intoxicating, or simply sweet. These bottled cures carried with them the dream of health that never quite arrived, but always seemed close enough to taste. The glass bottles that once gleamed with their promises often stood on tables in homes where the windows were firmly shut, curtains drawn close, shutters latched tight. The interior air grew heavy with lamp smoke, coal dust, and the scent of humanity confined. Outside, the evening breeze stirred trees and rattled gates. But within, Victorians guarded themselves from what they believed to be one of the most insidious dangers of all, night air. The fear was not rooted in whimsy, but in the prevailing medical thought of the day. Disease, they believed, did not travel through unseen germs. Those were whispers on the fringes, dismissed by many doctors. Instead, illness drifted on invisible mists, a corrupt atmosphere that seeped from swamps, graveyards, and open drains. These vapors, known as miasmas, carried sickness into homes, filling lungs with fevers, coughs, and wasting maladies. Daylight, with its warmth and brightness, was thought to purify the air, dispersing corruption. Night, by contrast, was a time when the world grew still, and the mists thickened, pooling in streets and gardens, slipping beneath doors and through cracks in shutters. And so, to protect themselves, families sealed their homes. A summer's evening, warm and fragrant, was endured with stifling discomfort indoors. A winter's night, already biting with cold, was further suffocated by the closing of every gap. Windows, rarely opened even by day, became untouchable after dusk. Mothers warned children not to linger by cracks in shutters. Servants were instructed to bolt windows tightly before lamps were lit. Bedrooms grew close, air heavy with breath, as generations passed nights without fresh wind upon their faces. This practice was not merely superstition. It was tied intimately to the scourge of diseases that haunted the Victorian world: cholera, typhoid, tuberculosis, malaria. When these swept through towns, they seemed to strike at random, and yet always more fiercely where air was foul, in alleys rank with refuse, in damp cellars, in neighborhoods by stagnant water. To the Victorian mind, the pattern was obvious. It was not unseen organisms, but the air itself that carried corruption. The cure was vigilance, sealing oneself away from the dangerous breath of night. And so the architecture of homes adjusted to the fear. Heavy drapes were not only decoration, but defense. Fabrics chosen as much to block drafts as to please the eye. Windows were fitted with thick shutters, not merely for privacy, but to guard against the creeping miasmas. Bedrooms, often shared by many, grew oppressively close, the only movement of air from the flickering of a candle or the faint stirring caused by a sleeper's breath. Some households burned incense, vinegar, or tar in basins, believing these scents would purify stagnant air, warding off contagion that might otherwise slip through unnoticed. The irony, of course, was that these stifling rooms often worsened health rather than preserving it. Tuberculosis, which thrived in closed, unventilated spaces, spread all the more easily. Infants suffocated in overheated nurseries, where windows were kept firmly shut against the killer of night breezes. Families coughed and wheezed in parlours where coal smoke hung thick, believing themselves safe so long as shutters barred the outside world. The very act of protection became a quiet invitation to disease. Yet for those who lived through epidemics, the fear felt justified. Cholera arrived not as a whisper, but as a thunderclap, striking down neighbours with terrifying speed. One day, a person was well. The next, they were writhing in agony, body emptied by relentless illness. To a family huddled indoors, it seemed clear that something in the night air carried the plague from house to house. Better to seal the windows, to shut out the invisible menace than to risk breathing it in. Night itself took on an ominous character. Streets fell silent not only from the natural rhythms of day's end, but from suspicion. To walk at night was to risk exposure. Those who worked late, lamplighters, watchmen, delivery men, were regarded almost with pity, their lungs forced to draw in what others so carefully excluded. Doctors making house calls after sunset carried with them the aura of danger, their very presence reminding households that illness walked abroad with the night air. Some believed that particular winds were more perilous than others. A breeze from marshy ground or low riverbanks carried suspicion. Fog, with its thick, damp embrace, was dreaded above all. To see mist rolling down a street was to imagine sickness spilling invisibly ahead of it, filling the lungs of anyone careless enough to breathe deeply. In such conditions, people clung to their firesides, pressing cloths soaked in vinegar to their faces, shunning the windows where damp pressed insistently against the panes. This fear reached into the rituals of sleep. Beds were piled high with blankets not merely for warmth, but to create a cocoon, a barrier between the sleeper and any draught. Curtains around four-poster beds were drawn tight, transforming the sleeper's rest into a kind of isolation chamber. Nightcaps, shawls, and even scarves were worn indoors, as though layers of cloth could shield not just from chill, but from the invisible touch of corrupted air. Children were tucked in carefully, the windows double-checked, the shutters secured with the same seriousness one might use against burglars. The belief in night air's danger was reinforced by the rhythms of illness itself. Fevers often worsened after sunset. Coughing fits grew stronger at night. Without knowledge of circadian rhythms or bacterial growth, people saw in this pattern the confirmation of their fears. The night, they believed, did not merely conceal illness, it awakened it, drew it into homes, and made it stronger. And yet, even in the grip of fear, contradictions abounded. Those who could afford country houses often built verandas or summer rooms, meant for lounging outdoors in daylight. By day, fresh air was thought to invigorate, to harden the constitution. Children were marched into gardens or along promenades to breathe deeply of the daylight breeze. But as dusk approached, shutters clapped shut, verandas emptied, and the outdoors once again became enemy ground. Health was sought in the same element, air, that was feared depending only on the hour of its presence. The medical debates of the time only deepened confusion. Some physicians began to whisper of contagion, of invisible particles carried not by air itself, but by contact, by water, by the secret filth of cities. Yet the miasma theory held firm in the popular mind, for it matched what people could see and smell. Foul air reeked of danger, and so it was blamed. The invisible nature of germs was too abstract, too distant a concept, for a public that trusted what their senses told them. Newspapers and pamphlets reinforced the dread. During cholera outbreaks, they warned citizens to guard against the damp air of evening, to close windows, to burn disinfecting agents. Advice flowed not only from doctors, but from civic leaders and reformers, who insisted that controlling air was controlling fate. Families complied, even as they whispered uneasily about neighbors who had fallen ill, despite every precaution. The result was a world in which health advice itself created a peculiar rhythm of daily life. Airing out rooms, if done at all, was a ritual confined to the hours after dawn and before dusk, a narrow band of time when air was deemed safe. The rest of the day, curtains hung heavy, rooms darkened, and the indoors became a place of both refuge and suffocation. In this way, the fear of night air shaped not only health, but the very atmosphere of Victorian domesticity. A life lived behind fabric and wood, enclosed, dim, and ever watchful. And perhaps that is the most striking image left to us. The household at night, shutters fastened, fires banked, bottles of tonic close at hand, all while the cool night wind passed harmlessly by outside, stirring leaves, carrying the scents of earth and flowers, but never allowed entry. The world within and the world without, divided not by walls, but by fear. A fear so powerful it reshaped how generations breathed, slept, and lived. If the air outside could not be trusted, then attention turned inward toward what was placed upon the table, what passed across the lips, and what sustained the body through long days of work and long nights of shuttered rooms. Food, in the Victorian imagination, was never simply nourishment. It was discipline, morality, medicine, and sometimes punishment. A plate of porridge, a sip of vinegar, a carefully measured serving of boiled vegetables. All could be framed as acts of health, and sometimes even as demonstrations of virtue. Meals in the 19th century were often stripped of indulgence when health was the concern. The body, it was thought, must be kept in balance, neither overstimulated by rich foods, nor weakened by too little sustenance. Doctors, pamphleteers, and household guides issued endless advice about the dangers of excess, warning against the creeping spectres of indigestion, gout, and melancholy, which could all, they believed, begin with the contents of the stomach. Among the strangest of dietary prescriptions was the embrace of vinegar, a liquid more commonly associated with cleaning or preserving. It was taken by the spoonful as a slimming aid and tonic. The sharp sting of its taste was thought to purify the body, burning away excess fat and keeping the constitution sharp. Young women in particular were urged toward vinegar regimens, especially those who longed to maintain a fashionable slimness. There are whispered accounts of pale girls sipping vinegar water daily, their complexions growing wan, their strength fading, yet their figures celebrated for their delicacy. What began as a method of supposed health became instead a quiet means of self-erasure, encouraged beneath the guise of medical wisdom. Gruel, too, entered the canon of health foods. Thin, watery, and endlessly dull, it was presented as the ideal sustenance for invalids, children, and those who must tread carefully with their digestion. A bowl of gruel contained little to excite the senses, but that was precisely its virtue. To the Victorian mind, blandness equaled safety. Spices, rich meats, and hearty sauces were considered dangerous stimulants, prone to inflaming the blood and unsettling the mind. Gruel, by contrast, soothed. It filled the stomach just enough, offering no temptation to excess, leaving the eater in a state of quiet restraint. The menus of health reformers went further still. Some promoted diets made almost entirely of vegetables, boiled into submission, served without seasoning, taken not for pleasure, but for moral clarity. Flesh foods, as meat was often called, were said to inflame the passions, stirring instincts that ought to remain under strict control. A plate of cabbage, a serving of boiled potatoes, or a slice of dry bread, on the other hand, kept body and soul in line. Food became a tool for shaping character, not simply maintaining life. Others insisted that fasting was the truest path to well-being. Skipping meals, consuming only small portions of broth or thin porridge, was framed as a way to cleanse the body of impurities. Hunger was not always viewed as a sign of deprivation, but as a signal that the body was correcting itself, burning away illness and restoring balance. In some circles, prolonged fasting became fashionable, almost a spectacle, as stories circulated of individuals who could live on little more than sips of water and still appear, outwardly at least, alive and upright. The wealthy, meanwhile, could afford to follow more elaborate regimens. Their tables might feature carefully rationed portions of game, fish, or delicacies, each arranged according to the dictates of whichever physician or health guru they consulted. A gentleman suffering from gout might be urged to abstain from wine and red meat, while his wife, fearing a pale complexion, was advised to sip vinegar and avoid butter. Their children, prone to coughs in winter, were steered toward milk diluted with water, porridge without sugar, and occasional doses of cod liver oil, a foul-tasting but much-praised addition to the household pantry. The working classes, in contrast, had fewer choices, yet even they were subject to the influence of health advice. Gruel and porridge were inexpensive, and thus common, while vinegar was cheap enough to be taken as a tonic. Cheap pamphlets and gossip carried the same warnings about rich or heavy foods, though for many, the notion of avoiding meat was less a matter of virtue than of necessity. When meat did appear, it was often stretched thin, boiled into soups, mixed with bread, or eaten sparingly, with the shadow of disapproval from reformers who linked hearty appetites to moral weakness. Underlying all of this was the constant fear of indigestion. The Victorian stomach was portrayed as fragile, easily unsettled by anything too spicy, too fatty, too sweet. Indigestion was not simply discomfort, but a root cause of endless other ailments. Headaches, melancholy, nervousness, even moral lapses. To eat improperly was to invite chaos into the body, and so discipline at the table became an act of preservation. Families spoke in hushed tones about meals that did not agree with someone, recounting with dread the hours of suffering that followed. Even beverages carried moral weight. Tea, while immensely popular, was sometimes accused of overstimulating the nerves, leaving drinkers weak or hysterical. Coffee was treated with similar suspicion, its dark bitterness tied to restlessness of body and mind. Milk and water were considered safer choices, though both carried their own risks. Milk often spoiled quickly, and water in many towns was dangerously contaminated, though this was not always understood. And so households turned again to vinegar water or to weak broths, seeking safety and simplicity. At the same time, there were movements toward what might now be recognized as early vegetarianism. Figures like Sylvester Graham preached the virtues of plain, plant-based diets, free from stimulants, spices, and flesh. His followers embraced coarse bread, porridge, and vegetables boiled without adornment, convinced that such meals fostered purity of mind as well as strength of body. To eat simply was to live simply, and in this simplicity lay health. The language surrounding food often blurred the line between medical advice and moral command. Gluttony was not just unhealthy, it was sinful. Delicacies were indulgences of the weak-willed, while restraint was celebrated as a sign of inner strength. A person who could subsist on little, who could master their appetite, was admired for both their health and their character. In this way, the dining table became a stage upon which Victorian values were performed daily. And yet, despite the seriousness with which these rules were followed, contradictions abounded. Wealthy households might serve lavish feasts to guests, laden with meats, puddings, and sweetmeats. even as the lady of the house personally adhered to vinegar and broth. Doctors warned against stimulants, yet prescribed port wine or brandy as restorative tonics. Children were urged to eat plainly, yet rewarded with sweets for good behavior. The reality of Victorian diets was a patchwork stitched together from fear, tradition, fashion, and necessity. What remains striking is how much the pursuit of health shaped not only what Victorians ate, but how they thought about eating at all. Food was never neutral. It was charged with meaning, responsibility, and risk. A spoonful of gruel was a shield against illness. A sip of vinegar was a step toward purity. A missed meal was a cleansing act. Even the most ordinary bite of bread or sip of milk was shadowed by the awareness that it could tip the delicate balance of the body one way or another. So we picture them, seated at tables by lamplight, shutters closed against the night, bowls of plain broth before them, spoons clinking softly against porcelain, the air inside heavy and still, the meal itself muted in flavor, the act of eating transformed from pleasure into precaution. And as the lamplight flickered on pale faces, as vinegar stung throats and gruel-filled stomachs without satisfying them, the Victorians reassured themselves that health could be maintained, not through joy or indulgence, but through the quiet discipline of every meal. The Victorian pursuit of health did not end at the dining table. Beyond the bowls of broth and the vinegar glasses, there lingered an older tradition, one that reached back centuries and still held a firm grip upon the imagination. It was the belief that within the veins themselves lay both the root of sickness and the key to its cure. If the body faltered, it was thought, then something within the blood had grown unbalanced, too plentiful, too corrupted, too heavy. The remedy was not found in diet alone, but in release, by letting blood flow out. Bloodletting was not a fringe practice, but a cornerstone of medical thought. It belonged to a world where health was measured in humours. The ancient theory that 4 bodily fluids, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, governed every aspect of human life. Though the Victorians lived in an age of trains, factories, and electric light, the shadow of this older doctrine remained. To bleed a patient was to restore balance, to draw out the fever, to relieve the body of its unseen burden. Doctors carried with them instruments designed for the task. The lancet, sharp and gleaming, was a familiar companion. With practiced precision, a vein could be opened and blood guided into a basin. Some procedures were light, just a few ounces removed, meant to ease a headache or calm a racing pulse. Others were more severe, demanding pints of blood, enough to leave a patient pale and weak, yet reassured that the sickness had been lessened. The sight of blood flowing freely was considered not a danger, but a sign of healing in progress. For those who shuddered at the knife, there was the gentler seeming leech. Slimy, silent, and strangely persistent, the leech could be applied to the skin, where it would attach itself and draw blood in slow, steady gulps. Apothecaries stocked jars of them, their dark shapes writhing in glass containers filled with water. Physicians recommended them liberally for inflammation, for bruising, for fevers, even for nervous complaints. A leech placed upon the temple was said to calm headaches. One affixed to the chest might ease congestion. For ailments below the skin's surface, doctors instructed patients to allow multiple leeches to feed, assuring them that relief would soon follow. In elegant homes, leeching was carried out with an air of quiet ritual. A physician or nurse might arrive with a small case, inside which wriggled several of the creatures. They were coaxed into place, sometimes encouraged with a drop of milk or a prick of the skin, until they latched and began their work. The patient lay still, watching the small bodies swell, enduring the peculiar sensation of blood being siphoned away. When the creatures had had their fill, they detached, leaving behind small wounds that continued to ooze, a sign, it was thought, that impurities were being expelled. Hospitals, too, kept leeches in great supply. In France, so great was the demand that millions were imported annually, their usefulness celebrated in medical texts and practical guides. The Victorians trusted them with ailments ranging from common colds, to grave illnesses, convinced that a creature so simple, so natural, could not fail to assist in restoring balance. Even children were not spared. Infants suffering from fevers or coughs were sometimes given leeches, their tiny bodies subjected to the same treatment as their elders. The popularity of bloodletting was reinforced by experience. Patients often reported feeling lighter, calmer, relieved after losing blood. Weakness was interpreted not as harm, but as proof of cure, evidence that the body's burden had been lessened. A man with high colour in his cheeks might be said to carry too much blood, his vitality brimming dangerously, and so he was bled until pallor replaced flush. A woman prone to hysteria might be calmed by leeches, her nerves quieted once the excess had been drawn away. The act itself, rather than the true cause of improvement or decline, gave comfort, and so the cycle continued. Not all bloodletting was done under medical supervision. Families often kept their own means at hand. Household manuals included instructions for applying leeches, noting how to encourage them to feed and how to soothe the skin afterward. Lancets were sometimes owned by laypeople, used when a sudden illness seemed to demand action before a doctor could arrive. In remote areas where physicians were scarce, self-bleeding was not uncommon, a grim but earnest attempt to preserve health through time-honored custom. The practice reached beyond the physical into the symbolic. Blood was life itself, and to release it was to take command over the mysteries of the body. In an era where so much illness was unexplained, where fevers came suddenly and deaths occurred without clear reason, bloodletting offered a tangible act. It was something one could do in the face of helplessness. That act of doing, even if ineffective, gave families and doctors alike the sense that they were not idle before the advance of sickness. And yet, for all its popularity, bloodletting carried dangers unrecognized by its practitioners. Weak patients, already frail from illness, could be pushed into collapse by the loss of blood. Infections sometimes followed, the open wounds inviting what physicians did not yet know how to name: bacteria. There were murmurs of doubt from some corners of the medical world, voices that questioned whether relief was truly achieved or whether lives were shortened by the very act meant to save them. But tradition held firm, reinforced by centuries of repetition and by the deeply ingrained trust of the public. The cultural reach of leeches and lancets extended even into literature and art. Satirical cartoons mocked physicians as eager bleeders, knives in hand, ready to drain patients at the slightest complaint. Yet satire coexisted with acceptance, for while jokes were made, treatments continued. The image of a doctor with lancet poised remained both familiar and authoritative, a symbol of medicine itself. Within the quiet rooms where patients lay, the procedure often unfolded in silence, broken only by the clink of a basin or the faint squirming of a leech in its jar. The lamplight caught the glint of steel or the sheen of damp, glistening skin. A faint trickle of blood stained linen, a sight at once unsettling and reassuring. Families gathered at bedsides, watching as the doctor directed the slow release, their own faces taut with hope. This practice, so strange to the modern eye, belonged to a broader Victorian world, where health was constantly negotiated between the body, the environment, and the tools available. Just as the air outside was distrusted and the food upon the plate weighed with moral significance, so too the blood within was regarded with caution. Too much of it, or too much in the wrong place, was a threat. Controlled removal was the cure. Even as new sciences emerged, whispering of microbes and the invisible causes of disease, the old methods persisted. They were trusted not because they were proven, but because they were known. The Victorians clung to them as to a familiar ritual, a bridge between centuries of tradition and the uncertainties of a rapidly changing age. And so the lancet flashed, the leech fed, and the basins filled. In homes, in hospitals, in quiet rural cottages, bloodletting endured, part of the great mosaic of advice, superstition, and earnest effort that shaped the Victorian pursuit of health. To imagine those rooms is to see pale faces under flickering lamps, curtains drawn tight against night air, bowls of gruel consumed by day, and now, in the stillness of illness, the dark red thread of life itself carefully, deliberately allowed to flow away. The Victorians, so intent on keeping their bodies balanced through diets, tonics, fresh air, or the absence of it, and the release of blood, also turned their attention to another means of control, movement. But in their hands, even something as natural as exercise became curious, mechanical, and strangely elaborate. The body was not simply to be walked or stretched. It was to be disciplined through contraptions, guided through regimens, and tested by inventions that promised vigor without chaos. The age was one of machines, and the human frame was increasingly regarded as a kind of mechanism itself, one that could be adjusted, repaired, or strengthened by external devices. Gymnasiums had existed before, but the Victorians gave them a distinctly industrial character. Heavy iron, polished wood, and intricate pulleys filled the rooms, transforming simple exertion into a performance of gears and levers. Muscles were not merely stretched, they were trained against resistance carefully calculated by the machine's design. To exercise was to submit oneself to an apparatus, as though the body must be shaped with the same precision as a piece of crafted metal. Some of the earliest of these devices resembled torture instruments more than tools of health. There were spring-loaded chairs in which one sat stiffly while pressing against resistance to strengthen the arms or legs. Rotating wheels demanded the turning of cranks, endlessly winding without purpose other than the movement itself. Straps and pulleys pulled against the limbs, forcing joints to stretch while a polished dial marked progress. All of this was carried out in orderly halls, under the supervision of instructors who emphasized form and steadiness over vigor. To strain in silence, to endure the slow resistance of polished machinery, was considered both dignified and healthful. For those who could not or would not attend such places, there were home versions of these devices. A corner of the parlor might contain a curious contraption of wood and brass, designed to fold away when not in use, but capable of providing an entire program of exertion when unfolded. Manuals described how even the most delicate individual, especially women, whose constitutions were regarded as fragile, might restore vitality by gently pushing or pulling against springs while seated in comfort. One did not need to run or sweat. One needed only to perform the prescribed motions with the apparatus, ideally while maintaining calm conversation. Chair workouts in particular held a peculiar popularity. The concept was that one could gain the benefits of exercise without ever leaving the supportive embrace of a sturdy seat. Sitting upright, a person could lift small weights attached to cords, stretch legs against padded bars, or rotate handles affixed to the chair's arms. Diagrams showed gentlemen in waistcoats and ladies in long skirts sitting primly as they raised their arms in unison or pressed their feet against resistance boards hidden beneath the upholstery. The activity was less about burning energy and more about demonstrating discipline, a kind of ritual that aligned the body with order and refinement. These exercises were often accompanied by elaborate instructions concerning posture and breath. The back must remain straight, the chin lifted, the gaze steady. Inhale gently as the arms extend, exhale as they return. The rhythms were so deliberate, almost meditative, as though the true benefit lay not in exertion, but in the calm repetition. It was exercise stripped of wildness, transformed into a sequence of gestures that suited the decorum of a Victorian drawing room. There were, too, more eccentric inventions. Some machines promised to shake the body into health by vibrating or oscillating the limbs. Others offered belts that could be strapped around the waist, attached to a mechanism that jiggled the flesh in hopes of stimulating circulation or reducing corpulence. The idea of passive exercise, the notion that one might sit or stand while the machine did the work, appealed greatly. To labor without effort, to improve without strain, seemed a miracle of modern ingenuity. For those who desired something more energetic, there were clubs, ropes, and weighted rings. Calisthenic routines gained favor, particularly among women, as a way to combine grace with strength. In parlors and schools, groups performed synchronized movements with light wooden clubs, swinging them in arcs that resembled dance more than exercise. Ropes were stretched across rooms for pulling and climbing, providing resistance and variety. The emphasis was always on control, never excess. To glow with effort was acceptable. To sweat profusely was indecorous. Even walking, the simplest of activities, became subject to prescription. Manuals advised how far, how fast, and under what conditions one should walk. Too much haste could overstrain the heart. Too little vigor was of no benefit. The correct pace was somewhere between, measured in steady steps along carefully chosen paths. Parks in Victorian cities became outdoor gyms of a sort where men and women took their constitutional walks with an air of duty. To stroll was not mere leisure, but medicine. Each lap around the gravel paths another dose of health. Underlying all these practices was a deep unease about stillness. To sit too long, it was believed, invited stagnation of the blood, weakness of the muscles, and decline of the spirit. But neither was uncontrolled motion desirable. The Victorian solution was structure, machines that guided every movement, chairs that supported while demanding exertion, instructors who corrected every posture. Health lay in balance, in the measured and mechanical use of the body, not in abandon. And so, behind the drawn curtains of homes where night air was kept at bay, and in the bright halls where polished apparatus gleamed, bodies moved in curious ways. Arms swung in prescribed arcs, legs pressed against hidden springs, torsos bent and straightened in slow rhythm. The sounds were muted, the faint creak of wood, the soft clink of metal, the rustle of skirts. There was little laughter, little spontaneity, only the steady insistence that movement, properly ordered, would preserve health and prevent the decline that hovered ever near. Children, too, were drawn into these regimens. Schools introduced calisthenics to instill both health and discipline. Rows of boys and girls swung their arms in unison, marched in place, or lifted light weights, all under the watchful eye of teachers. Exercise was not play but training, a shaping of the young body into habits of order. Parents encouraged it as part of the same philosophy that guided diet and sleep. The body must be managed, corrected, improved, lest it falter. In hospitals and sanatoriums, odd contraptions multiplied. Patients recovering from illness were guided into machines that stretched their limbs or rotated their joints. The belief being that such mechanical assistance hastened recovery. Bedridden individuals were sometimes provided with small hand-crank devices to keep their arms active, even as their bodies lay still. The goal was to prevent the dreaded weakness of inactivity, a phrase that haunted medical texts of the time. It is easy now to smile at these inventions, to imagine rows of solemn Victorians dutifully pumping handles or sitting upright in vibrating chairs. Yet behind the strangeness lay genuine fear. The 19th century was an age of industry, of factory work and urban life, and many worried that modern existence bred softness, fragility, decline. Exercise, guided by contraptions or chairs, was a way to reclaim strength without abandoning respectability. It was a way to prove that one could live in a mechanical age and still maintain health. And so the contraptions multiplied. Advertisements promised vitality, instructors preached the virtues of daily regimens, and households acquired their own peculiar devices. Within the steady rhythm of these routines, Victorians sought security, a body disciplined into order, protected against the chaos of sickness and the creeping weakness of idleness. In their quiet rooms, lit by lamps, they moved in measured arcs, pressing, pulling, stretching, always under the guidance of machine or manual. To them it was not odd, but rational, a continuation of their endless pursuit of health by whatever means seemed most certain. And in that pursuit, even the act of sitting in a chair became an opportunity to exercise, to preserve, to endure. Victorian society, so precise in its rituals and so earnest in its pursuit of health, often placed more faith in the contents of a bottle than in the physician's hand. Rows of small glass vessels lined apothecaries' shelves, their labels stamped with promises of vigor, relief, and longevity. They shone like jewels in dimly lit shops, each one bearing a name that sounded both scientific and mysterious. Elixirs, tonics, cordials, restoratives. To the weary, they offered hope. To the desperate, certainty. It was a world where the cure often tasted sweet, burned warmly in the throat, and carried secrets that were not easily spoken aloud. These concoctions, broadly known as patent medicines, occupied a curious space in Victorian life. They were not truly prescribed by physicians, yet they circulated more widely than most legitimate remedies. They were marketed with flamboyant claims, wrapped in advertisements that filled newspapers and magazines, accompanied by glowing testimonials that spoke of miraculous recoveries. A mother restored from wasting sickness, a father relieved of pain, a child lifted from the brink of decline. Such stories were printed beside illustrations of radiant faces and bottles glinting in the light. The names alone carried authority. Doctor, somebody's restorative elixir, Professor so-and-so's life invigorator, the universal tonic of health. The allure of these medicines lay not only in their promises, but also in their accessibility. Anyone could buy them, without examination, without questions. A laborer could purchase the same remedy as a wealthy merchant, a housemaid the same bottle as a duchess. They democratized hope, making the possibility of health available for a few coins, placed on the counter in exchange for a corked bottle. In this way, they bypassed the uncertainties of professional medicine, which was often costly, experimental, and, despite the authority of doctors, just as dangerous as the illness itself. But within these shimmering bottles lay something far more potent than herbs and minerals. Many of them contained generous measures of alcohol, hidden in plain sight, masked by the language of medicine. To the Victorian mind, this was not necessarily scandalous. Alcohol had long been used as a carrier for tinctures and as a preservative for botanical extracts. Yet in patent medicines, it was present in such quantities that a dose did more than soothe. It comforted, it warmed, it dulled pain, and it eased the restless mind. For those whose lives were marked by hardship and exhaustion, the daily spoonful prescribed on the label could become a ritual of quiet intoxication. Consider the bottle of bitters, a popular category of patent medicine. Infused with herbs and roots, bitters were sold as aids to digestion, stimulants for the appetite, or tonics for the constitution. The instructions often suggested taking a small glass before meals. But with alcohol content rivaling that of strong spirits, they were, in essence, socially acceptable ways of drinking. A woman might sip her tonic discreetly in the parlor, free from the stigma attached to the public house, yet feeling the same gentle flush that came from wine or brandy. A gentleman could recommend his favorite restorative to a friend, cloaking indulgence in the language of health. Not all bottles relied solely on alcohol. Many contained opiates, chloral, or other substances that dulled pain and soothed the nerves. Laudanum, a tincture of opium dissolved in alcohol, was especially common, though often disguised under gentler names in patent medicines. It was given to children for teething, to women for menstrual discomfort, to men for the weariness of long days. The quiet haze it produced was described as relief, but it blurred the boundary between cure and dependence. Advertisements rarely mentioned such ingredients, preferring to emphasize natural roots, exotic spices, or vague life-giving principles. The secrecy of these formulas was part of their charm. Makers guarded their recipes jealously, claiming proprietary rights and refusing to disclose the precise ingredients. This secrecy gave an aura of mystery, suggesting that within the bottle lay a carefully guarded secret of vitality. In reality, the recipes often varied little. Alcohol for preservation and effect, opium or cocaine for relief, sugar, and flavorings for palatability. Yet the labels hinted at ancient wisdom, at formulas drawn from distant lands or rediscovered from forgotten manuscripts. To swallow a spoonful was to partake in something more than medicine. It was to join in a tradition of hidden knowledge, wrapped in the glamour of secrecy. The marketing of these remedies was as elaborate as their contents. Posters depicted radiant women holding bottles, their cheeks rosy with newfound health. Pamphlets distributed in railway stations and markets described miracle recoveries in breathless prose. Testimonials were published in newspapers, with grateful patients writing of their return to life after years of decline. Often these accounts were inventions, penned by copywriters rather than genuine sufferers, but they carried conviction, for the public wanted to believe. In an age when illness lurked in the smoke-filled air of cities, and when epidemics could strike without warning, the promise of control, even in liquid form, was irresistible. Patent medicines found their way into every corner of Victorian life. In rural cottages, a bottle might stand on the mantel beside the family Bible, as both remedy and talisman. In city homes, they filled cabinets, each one reserved for a particular complaint: indigestion, nerves, sleeplessness, melancholy. Sailors carried them on voyages, soldiers tucked them into packs, mothers administered them to children with tender insistence. To drink a tonic was not merely to seek health, it was to participate in a ritual of reassurance, a small act of faith that one was protected against the invisible threats of weakness and disease. The hidden alcohol in these medicines gave them a special place in social life. At a time when temperance movements gained momentum and drinking was increasingly scrutinized, patent medicines provided a loophole. A woman who would never be seen entering a tavern might consume daily doses of a restorative cordial without reproach. Men could share a bottle under the guise of discussing health, avoiding the censure that came with drunkenness. Even children, unwittingly, were given doses that dulled them into quiet compliance. The boundary between medicine and indulgence blurred until it disappeared entirely. There were darker sides to this dependence. Families came to rely on their daily doses, not for health, but for the comfort of the alcohol or opiates they contained. Some sank into quiet addiction, disguised as devotion to a cure. Physicians occasionally raised alarms, but the public's trust in these remedies was deep, and regulation was minimal. It would take decades before the true dangers of patent medicines were exposed, and by then, generations had lived and died under their influence. Yet, in the dimly lit homes where bottles gleamed like amber jewels, the secrecy remained unchallenged. Labels were read with trust, corks pulled with hope, and spoons raised with expectation. Each swallow was a promise that health could be restored, that vitality could be recaptured, that the burdens of modern life could be eased by something as simple as liquid in glass. Patent medicines were not merely cures, they were symbols. They embodied the Victorian desire to master health, to control the unpredictable body, to find certainty in a world of uncertainty. Whether one believed in the exotic herbs they claimed to contain, or merely in the ritual of taking them, they gave comfort. The warmth of the alcohol, the sweetness of the syrup, the soothing haze of the narcotics, they all worked together to create not only relief, but belief. And so, in parlours and kitchens, in cottages and townhouses, the bottles remained. Their corks popped open with a familiar sound, their contents poured with reverence into glasses and spoons. They were shared quietly, consumed dutifully, trusted deeply. They represented not only a strange chapter of Victorian health advice, but also a mirror to the age itself, an age of secrecy, of restless pursuit of health, of faith placed in the small shining vessels that promised everything yet revealed so little. In the quiet glow of gaslight when the day's burdens settled into silence, Victorians often turned their gaze inward, seeking not only the health of the body, but the calm of the spirit. For all their tonics, contraptions, and carefully measured regimens, there remained an unease that no physical cure could ease. Illness was not only in the flesh, they believed, but in the very currents of the mind and soul. And so, alongside physicians and bottles of medicine, there arose another kind of healer, one who claimed not to treat the body directly, but to restore harmony to the unseen forces that governed it. This world was made of whispers, dim parlours, and the slow rhythm of mesmerist passes across a patient's brow. It was a place where invisible currents were thought to flow between bodies, where unseen energies could be harnessed to relieve suffering, and where contact with realms beyond the living was imagined as a balm for restless nerves. It was the realm of spiritualism and mesmerism, of seances and magnetic healing, where the boundaries between medicine and mysticism dissolved into something softer, stranger, and deeply Victorian. The fascination began with mesmerism, named for Franz Mesmer, whose theories of animal magnetism spread across Europe in the late 18th century and found fertile ground in the 19th. According to Mesmer and his followers, a subtle fluid or force flowed through all living beings, connecting them like the invisible tides of a hidden sea. When disturbed, this current produced illness. When guided, it could restore health. The mesmerist, with practiced hands and steady concentration, was said to redirect this flow, smoothing disruptions, unblocking pathways, and bringing the patient back to balance. Victorians, ever receptive to systems that explained the mysteries of the body, found in mesmerism both reassurance and wonder. A patient reclined in a darkened room while the mesmerist moved slowly around them, tracing deliberate gestures in the air or lightly touching the temples. Sometimes the subject sank into a trance, breathing deeply, eyes fluttering shut, as if lulled into sleep by invisible hands. On waking, they often reported relief, pain diminished, anxiety eased, strength restored. Whether by suggestion, by calm ritual, or by the sheer power of belief, the effects could be profound. It was not only pain that mesmerism promised to cure, but also the restless afflictions of the mind, nervous exhaustion, melancholy, sleeplessness. All were thought to yield to the steady influence of magnetic passes. Women, in particular, were frequent subjects, as their fragile constitutions, so physicians claimed, left them vulnerable to the invisible strains of modern life. The mesmeric trance, gentle and mysterious, was offered as both treatment and release, a way of calming what could not be soothed by medicine or machines. Yet mesmerism was not confined to health alone. It opened doors to realms beyond the body, hinting at powers that brushed against the supernatural. Those in trance were sometimes believed capable of clairvoyance, of perceiving distant places or even the thoughts of others. Parlours that began with healing sessions drifted into demonstrations of uncanny perception, and soon mesmerism blurred into another movement rising in Victorian society: spiritualism. Spiritualism was less concerned with the body's magnetism and more with the presence of spirits. Beginning in the 1840s, with tales of mysterious rappings in American farmhouses, it swept across the Atlantic and into British drawing rooms, where mediums claimed to summon the dead. Seances became social events, conducted in hushed tones around tables lit by flickering candles. Sitters held hands, concentrated on the unseen, and listened for knocks, whispers, or the faint movements of objects. In the dark, voices were said to emerge, and messages from departed loved ones brought both tears and comfort. For many, this was more than diversion. It was a form of healing. The Victorians lived in constant proximity to death. Epidemics swept through cities. Child mortality was high, and families were often fractured by sudden loss. Spiritualism offered connection where grief left silence. To hear a message, however faint, from a lost son or daughter was to feel that death had not stolen everything. In a society where mourning itself was elaborately ritualized, the seance became another chamber of consolation, a ritual of health for the soul. Mediums themselves often took on the role of healers, not only contacting spirits, but channeling energies they claimed could mend the sick. Some would lay hands upon patients, transmitting vital force drawn from beyond. Others spoke of guides, spirits of physicians or sages, who worked through them to diagnose and cure. These practices intertwined seamlessly with mesmerism, creating a tapestry of belief in which body, mind, and spirit were inseparably linked by invisible threads. The atmosphere of such sessions was both theatrical and intimate. Curtains drawn, lamps dimmed, the air heavy with anticipation. Participants leaned forward, waiting for the first sound. The creak of wood beneath the table, the faintest knock from an unseen source, the flicker of a candle flame, all were taken as signs. And when a voice emerged, often through the medium's lips, yet spoken as if by another, it was received with reverence. In such moments, the living and the dead seemed to mingle, and the sick might believe they had been touched by forces more powerful than any doctor's prescription. Skeptics abounded, of course. Newspapers exposed fraudulent mediums who used wires, hidden assistants, or ventriloquism to simulate spirits. Scientists denounced the claims of animal magnetism as illusion or self-deception. Yet these exposures did little to dampen popular enthusiasm. The very uncertainty was part of the allure. Perhaps some mediums deceived, but perhaps others did not. Perhaps, in some hidden corner of the parlor, genuine forces stirred, unseen but potent. What mattered for many Victorians was not proof but effect. A woman who found her melancholy lifted after a mesmeric session. A man who felt strength return after the laying on of hands. A grieving mother comforted by a whispered message. All experienced real relief, however it was produced. In this sense, mesmerism and spiritualism were less about science than about care. They provided spaces where suffering was acknowledged, where invisible wounds were treated with invisible salves, where faith itself became a form of medicine. These practices also reflected a broader Victorian tendency, the belief that unseen forces governed the world. Electricity coursed invisibly through wires, magnetism guided compasses, invisible germs began to be suspected as causes of disease. If such forces could shape matter and health, why not others? Forces of mind, spirit, or soul. To many, it seemed only natural that unseen energies might restore balance, heal illness, or bridge the divide between living and dead. In parlours across Britain then, the pursuit of health took on a spiritual hue. The sick reclined beneath the mesmerist's hand, the grieving gathered around tables, the anxious sought solace in trances. It was a health advice unlike any other, one that counselled not pills or diets, but the opening of the self to invisible tides. The remedies were not swallowed or measured, they were felt, intuited, believed. This, too, was part of the Victorian obsession with health. The idea that no corner of life was beyond its reach. The body must be disciplined by contraptions, nourished by peculiar diets, steadied by tonics. The soul, too, must be tended, its invisible aches soothed by unseen forces. To live well was to balance both, to accept that the material and the immaterial flowed together, shaping not only sickness, but the possibility of recovery. And so, as the candles burned low and the silence of the séance deepened, Victorians sat with hands clasped, waiting for the touch of the unseen. For some, the knocks and whispers that followed were tricks of clever mediums. For others, they were genuine glimpses into a world beyond. But for nearly all who gathered, the act itself was healing, a ritual of faith in a time when health was never certain, and the boundaries between the body and the spirit remained as thin as the flicker of a flame. The Victorian fascination with health was not confined to hushed parlours or dim séance rooms. It spilled onto the streets, into marketplaces, and beneath the bright glow of gaslit theatres where spectacle and medicine became indistinguishable. If the unseen currents of mesmerism promised quiet restoration, the world of quack doctors offered something far louder. A dazzling parade of cures, concoctions and performances, each more extraordinary than the last. Here, health was not delivered in silence, but announced with the sound of drums, the blare of trumpets, and the smooth persuasion of a man on a stage. Crowds gathered eagerly, jostling against one another, not so much to be healed as to be entertained. And in these spaces, medicine became theatre, an art of persuasion that relied not on microscopes or anatomical charts, but on glittering bottles, persuasive words, and the promise of transformation. The figures at the centre of these shows were known by many names: quack doctors, mountebanks, itinerant healers. They were men, and sometimes women, who travelled from town to town, often arriving with little more than a wagon laden with bottles, jars, and banners. Their reputation preceded them, carried by rumour and advertisement, promising miraculous cures for every ailment that plagued the Victorian imagination. Consumption, gout, nervous disorders, paralysis, baldness. There was no malady beyond their reach. The arrival of such a figure was a kind of event. Children pressed close to watch, merchants paused their trade, and those who carried aches or hidden fears of illness edged nearer, curious to hear what wonders might be offered. The quack doctor knew the value of spectacle. Dressed in bright coats or theatrical costumes, he commanded the crowd like an actor, his voice rising above the noise of the marketplace. Beside him stood assistants, sometimes musicians, sometimes costumed performers, all part of the stagecraft designed to transform medicine into drama. On makeshift stages, demonstrations unfolded. A man too weak to walk might stagger forward, leaning heavily on a stick, only to be given a dose of some shimmering elixir, and then, with theatrical timing, cast aside his support and stride about with apparent vigor. Women faint with exhaustion were revived by aromatic powders waved beneath their noses. Bottles were uncorked, liquids poured into gleaming glasses, powders set aflame to crackle and spark. Each gesture calculated to delight and astonish. The line between healing and entertainment blurred until the two were indistinguishable. The remedies themselves were as varied as the performances. Some were exotic mixtures with names that hinted at far-off lands, elixirs from the Orient, tinctures from the New World, tonics made from herbs supposedly gathered in the shadow of distant mountains. Others were more familiar, but dressed in new attire, syrups thick with sugar and alcohol, powders laced with opium, or simple herbal infusions presented as secret formulas. What mattered was not the substance, but the story wrapped around it, the narrative of discovery, of hidden knowledge brought forth for the benefit of the suffering public. And the public believed, or at least allowed themselves to believe. In a time when illness was constant and genuine cures few, even the faint promise of relief was enough to draw the desperate and the curious alike. To purchase a bottle from the quack was not only to buy a liquid, but to buy hope, however fleeting, and to take part in the grand theatre of health that brightened the otherwise grey rhythms of daily life. The stages themselves often resembled miniature theatres of cure. Painted banners depicted robust figures shaking off chains of illness, or skeletons restored to flesh by the power of some marvellous concoction. Slogans proclaimed vitality, longevity, and the end of suffering. To stand before such a scene was to be caught between awe and amusement, uncertain whether to laugh at the absurdity or to marvel at the possibility that perhaps, just perhaps, it might all be true. The most successful of these figures became travelling celebrities, remembered not only for their cures, but for their performances. They knew how to work a crowd, how to build suspense, and how to weave words into spells as potent as any medicine. The bottle handed to a customer was only part of the experience. The true cure lay in the persuasive charm, the shared excitement of the audience, and the brief suspension of disbelief that transformed suffering into hope. For the Victorian mind, hungry for novelty, these quack doctors occupied a strange but vital role. Official medicine, with its leeches, its bloodletting, and its uncertain treatments, could be grim and unpromising. By contrast, the travelling showman offered vitality and spectacle. He provided not only medicine, but diversion, a reminder that illness need not always be faced in silence, but could be wrapped in laughter, music, and applause. It was also a profoundly democratic form of medicine. Unlike the private consultations of physicians, often confined to the wealthy, the quack doctor addressed everyone. He stood in public squares, his words available to rich and poor alike, his bottles sold to whoever could pay the modest price. In this sense, he democratized hope, bringing health, or at least the illusion of it, within reach of ordinary men and women. Of course, not all audiences were convinced. Satirical magazines lampooned these characters, depicting them as tricksters preying on the gullible. Pamphlets warned against their dangerous potions, many of which contained little more than alcohol or narcotics in sweetened form. Yet even critics could not entirely resist the fascination of the show. To watch a trembling patient rise to their feet, to hear the booming declarations of cure. It was as much theatre as deception, a performance too enthralling to dismiss outright. Some quack doctors went further, constructing elaborate indoor shows where healing was staged as grand entertainment. These were not simple stalls in marketplaces, but full theatres of cure, with velvet curtains, gaslight chandeliers, and audiences seated in anticipation. On stage, assistants would collapse dramatically, only to be revived by miraculous remedies. Lectures would unfold with the pacing of plays, mixing medical jargon with dramatic gestures. In these spaces, health was not simply treated but performed, each cure another act in a carefully choreographed spectacle. Travelling shows also merged with the world of fairs and circuses. Amid booths selling sweets and mechanical novelties, a brightly painted wagon promised transformation. Step forward, and one could watch not only the bearded lady or the contortionist, but also the healing of the sick. To the Victorian mind, accustomed to a world where wonder and science often overlapped, such juxtapositions seemed perfectly natural. Medicine was one more marvel in a world of curiosities. Even those who saw through the illusions often found themselves enchanted. To mock the quack doctor was one thing, to resist the pull of his show was another. The colour, the sound, the spectacle, these things made illness seem less heavy, less inescapable. And perhaps this was the greatest gift the quack offered, even more than his bottles and powders. The chance to believe, however briefly, that health was within reach, that vitality could be purchased and performed, and that the darkness of sickness could be banished by the light of spectacle. In this way, the travelling healers, the mountebanks and the quacks formed a curious counterpart to the quieter movements of mesmerists and mediums. Where the latter worked in whispers, the former thrived in shouts. Where one sought to soothe with silence, the other dazzled with noise. Yet both shared the same underlying aim: to address the restless uncertainty of Victorian life, to promise relief where conventional medicine offered little, and to transform the fear of illness into something more bearable. And so the quack doctor's cart rolled on, from town to town, from fair to fair, its banners fluttering in the wind. Children ran alongside, calling out. Adults followed with cautious curiosity. And soon another square, another marketplace, another theatre would become for a time a stage for health. The promises were rarely kept, but the performance endured, etched into memory, a strange chapter in the Victorian pursuit of well-being. In the soft glow of hindsight, these figures seem less like villains than like actors in a grand play. They deceived, yes, but they also entertained, consoled, and in some strange way, healed, not with medicine that cured, but with words and theatre that made suffering seem lighter. And in the endless Victorian search for health, perhaps that too had its place. The bright banners of quack doctors faded slowly from the public squares, their painted wagons rolling into memory rather than reality. The gaslit theatres of miraculous cures dimmed, and the bottles that once glittered under stage lights gathered dust on forgotten shelves. By the late Victorian years, a quiet change began to seep through the atmosphere of health and healing. It was not sudden, nor was it simple, but it came like the turning of a tide, slow, steady, and unstoppable. Science, which had hovered in the background of the century, began to move forward with a firmer step. Laboratories that once seemed shadowy and abstract grew in importance, and men in white coats replaced the flamboyant figures of travelling shows. Where once the cure for a cough might be shouted from a marketplace stage, it was now more likely to be explained in the pages of medical journals, written with a language both colder and more precise. It is easy to imagine this shift as a sharp break, but in truth, it unfolded with the same strangeness and contradictions that defined the Victorian world. Old habits clung stubbornly, even as new discoveries emerged. A man might one day attend a lecture on germs and the hidden world of bacteria, then the next find himself still dosing with a tonic spiked with brandy and opium. The familiar comfort of the old remedies did not vanish overnight. They retreated slowly, step by step, giving way to a different vision of health. At the heart of this transformation was a new confidence in observation and proof. Microscopes revealed landscapes that no naked eye had seen. Tiny organisms swarming unseen in drops of water, invisible agents of disease that explained what superstition and quackery had long tried to cloak in mystery. The discovery of germs did not merely alter treatment, it reshaped imagination itself. Illness was no longer the product of mists, of bad air, or of hidden poisons in the blood. It was the work of minute creatures, enemies that could be studied, classified, and eventually fought. Hospitals, once regarded as places of death more than healing, began to adopt new methods. Cleanliness, once dismissed as an aesthetic concern, became central to survival. Carbolic acid washed across surgical tools, white linens replaced stained cloths, and the smell of antiseptic began to permeate wards where once only the stench of sickness had hung. To walk through a hospital in these later years was to enter a different world, one that no longer echoed with the cries of patients bled by leeches, but instead carried the quiet discipline of new science at work. Yet outside those institutions, the culture of health still bore the traces of earlier eccentricities. Patent medicines continued to sell, though increasingly they carried labels that were scrutinized by law. Traveling healers still made their rounds, though fewer crowds gathered to watch them. People had not yet forgotten the thrill of spectacle, nor the comfort of the bottle purchased from a persuasive voice. And even as doctors spoke of germs and antisepsis, many households clung to habits of vinegar tonics, gruel diets, or shuttered windows against the dreaded night air. Change, after all, is rarely about erasure. It is more often about layering, the new pressed gently over the old, creating a patchwork that reflects both. For the Victorians, the decline of strange remedies was not a clean vanishing, but a fading, a gradual dimming as the light of science grew stronger. The state itself began to take an interest. Laws were drafted, regulations enforced. What had once been a marketplace free for all of cures now faced oversight. The sale of poisons like arsenic, once casually prescribed, was restricted. Advertisements, once filled with wild promises of miraculous transformation, came under scrutiny. The government, slow though it was, began to recognize that the public's health was too precious to be left entirely to the theatrics of traveling doctors and bottled wonders. This did not mean that faith in spectacle disappeared. Even as laboratories rose, Victorians continued to crowd into lecture halls and exhibitions where science itself was staged as performance. The difference was that the drama shifted from quackery to demonstration. Instead of a bottle promising to cure paralysis, an audience might now watch a microscope reveal the twitch of a microbe, or hear a scientist describe how invisible germs might be killed with boiling water. Wonder remained, but its language changed. For ordinary people, the transition was uneven. Rural communities often held onto old remedies long after cities embraced antiseptic practices. The weight of tradition was heavy, and in the face of illness, the familiar always felt safer than the unknown. A grandmother might still recommend a vinegar tonic, even as her grandson read about Pasteur's experiments. The two worlds overlapped, neither entirely displacing the other, coexisting in the same households, in the same minds. The Victorian obsession with health did not lessen, but it became more disciplined. Where once vitality was sought through corsets, cold baths, or bottled elixirs, it was now pursued with hygiene, vaccination, and diet shaped by new nutritional science. The shift did not strip life of its eccentricities, it merely transformed them. The pursuit of strange remedies had prepared the ground, instilled in people the idea that health could be managed, improved, and shaped. Science stepped into that expectation and filled it with different tools. The decline of quackery also marked the rise of trust in institutions. Doctors, once viewed with suspicion for their bleeding and leeching, gained new authority as their treatments began to show clearer results. Hospitals, once feared, became places of refuge. Laboratories, mysterious in their workings, became symbols of progress. Slowly, The figure of the flamboyant quack on his stage gave way to the quiet confidence of the physician with his instruments and his sterile tools. But one must be careful not to imagine that the strange vanished entirely. Even as science gained ground, the taste for novelty endured. Victorians, like all people, were drawn to the edges of certainty, to the possibility that something hidden might still offer more than the established knowledge of the day. The popularity of spiritualism, of mesmerism, of dietary fads, and of patent cures long after their decline reveals that human desire for wonder could not be extinguished. Science became the dominant voice, but it did not silence the whispers of curiosity and eccentric belief. The slow decline of strange remedies, then, was less a story of defeat than of transformation. What had once been staged in markets and theatres became absorbed into quieter, more ordered spaces. The pursuit of vitality, always central to Victorian life, shifted from the loud promises of spectacle to the measured claims of evidence. Yet beneath it all, the same restless longing remained, the desire to ward off frailty, to master the body, to make life a little less uncertain. By the time the century drew to its close, the world of health had changed irrevocably. The sounds of quack doctors shouting their cures faded into memory, their painted wagons replaced by the steady hum of hospital wards and the quiet scribble of physicians' pens. Strange remedies still lingered, sold in dark bottles or whispered as home cures, but their reign was waning. Science, with its proofs and its disciplines, had claimed its place, and so the Victorian pursuit of health ended not in silence, but in transformation. The journey from corsets and arsenic tonics to antiseptics and germ theory was not merely a medical shift, but a cultural one. It revealed a society moving slowly from wonder to evidence, from spectacle to science, carrying with it the shadows of old remedies, even as it stepped into a new age of healing. The decline was not mourned, for most welcomed the relief that genuine cures brought. Yet, in the stillness of hindsight, there lingers a strange affection for the eccentricity of it all, for the gaslit theatres, the bottled miracles, the whispered fears of night air, and the endless search for vitality that defined an age. For even as science took hold, the story of health remained, at its core, a story of longing, of hope, and of the peculiar ways humans seek to make sense of their fragile bodies in a vast and uncertain world. And so, as our story slowly closes tonight, we leave behind the cobblestone streets and dimly lit parlours of the Victorian world. A world where medicine was both theatre and faith, where powders, syrups, and strange devices promised to ward off death and restore life, even when they did little more than comfort the imagination. We've wandered through their odd cures, vinegar drinks before supper, electric belts that buzzed against the skin, and travelling doctors who cured more with words than with science. We've heard how fresh air was feared as much as it was praised, how a single draught could be seen as deadly, and how even the act of eating gruel or walking along the seaside was believed to shape the body and the soul. What we have faced together in this story is not just a catalogue of strange advice, but the deep, very human fear of sickness, the desire to cling to life, to find control where so little could be guaranteed. The Victorians reached for bottles, charms, and rituals because they longed for certainty in a world where disease was everywhere, and medicine was still learning to find its footing. And now, with the lamps burning low and the last echoes of their footsteps fading, perhaps it is easier to see them not as strange, but as familiar. For even today, in quieter ways, we still search for that same comfort, wondering which remedies to trust, which habits to keep, and how best to care for this fragile thing we call health. Thank you for staying with me through this long, winding journey. If your eyes are heavy now, let them close, and let the Victorians keep their watch in history's shadows. Before you drift off, though, I'll ask one small favour. Take a moment to subscribe to this channel. It helps these stories travel further, reaching others who might be listening in the dark tonight, just like you. And if you'd like, share in the comments where you're listening from, and what time it is for you right now. I always find it calming, almost like seeing tiny lanterns flickering across a map, voices joined together in the quiet of the night. Rest well, and until the next story, good night.